Welcome back, viewers. Let's quickly also talk about Telangana and especially the city of Hyderabad that has seen a significant rise in cases in the last few days. In fact, now Telangana and Hyderabad itself is registering over 700 cases on a daily basis. What's really going on? Somit is joining us with the latest information. Somit, is it simply because the testing has been ramped up, or is there a larger concern about the extent of the infection spread?
It's just because of the testings have been increased in the Hyderabad city and also the neighboring districts of Hyderabad. Today, just now, the health department has released the bulletin, and today again, Telangana reported the highest single-day spike of 879 new COVID-19 positive cases, and the total number of cases in the state has increased to 9,553, including 5,109 active cases, and 4,224 have been discharged, and 220 deaths. So that is, three also have been declared dead today due to COVID-19. And this is the situation now. The Telangana government has started mass testings that we have also reported last week that Telangana CM KCR has announced that 50,000 testings will be conducted in 30 assembly segments in Hyderabad and neighboring districts, that is Medchal and Rangareddy. Even if we see today, in Hyderabad, 652 were tested positive in 879, and in Medchal, 112 have been turned out to be positive, and in Rangareddy, the 64, and rest from the other districts. If we see earlier, that is, first case was reported in Telangana on March 2nd. And later, from the 2nd March, it took 55 days for the figure to reach 1,000 cases. Now, in just last 2 days, that is today and yesterday, over 1,500 cases have been reported from just Hyderabad city. Around 1,500 cases from the Hyderabad city. This is the situation here, and the Telangana government is now trying to increase more number of testings because they have the health minister has also conducted a review meeting with all the private hospitals, organizers of the private hospitals, and also the diagnostic centers, and he has asked them to ensure that. All the data, what the testings data which they are conducting should be uploaded to the concerned websites, government websites, and they should also ensure that all the patients which they are treating are into the hospitals, and that data should be given to the government and should be uploaded in the ICMR website.
All right, Shaumin, thanks so much for bringing us all of those updates, honestly, what has happened is with the ramping, with the testing really ramped up, the true picture is actually now emerging for Hyderabad and rest of Telangana, and now it remains to be seen how the government really tackles it, and if the government is really prepared to see this high number of cases now emerge on a daily basis. Shaumin, thanks for bringing us those updates. Well, that is as far as India's big cities are concerned. Let's move on to the other big conversation. The big national talking point outside of coronavirus has been India-China. And the build-up that started from May 5th, the adventurism by China, and the brutal clash that took place on June 15, to the point where we have come now, viewers, with both sides having heavily mobilize their armies, their forces along the line of actual control, especially in the Ladakh region, while talks do continue. Now, India seems to have adopted a multi-pronged strategy here, and we're not just limiting it to military talks or just the diplomatic talks. It's happening at all fronts. Economically, we are looking at different ways of also reminding China to not take us lightly. But let's talk about what happened as far as the military talks are concerned first. Now, we have learned from sources that, yes, there has been largely an agreement at this marathon conversation that went on for over 10 hours about disengagement, and gradually disengagement is likely to take place. There is at least consensus on that the troops will be withdrawn in a phased manner. We also understand that tomorrow there will be another crucial meeting that will be held, crucial round of talks that will be held to really finalize the protocol that has to be followed by both sides to implement this. Disengagement will be from all areas. China is also, in fact, expected to move back from Finger 4, one of those crucial points that has become a big bone of contention now. And all of this will be done via high-level military talks that are being held between the two sides. But there are problems, there are big challenges, viewers, especially in the light of what has happened. Don't forget that this was initiated by the Chinese, who began to move into our territory, began their build-up, began the provocations from May 5th. And there have been journalists who've been constantly reporting about this whole build-up since May 5th. By June 6th, we had actually come to an agreement with the Chinese on de-escalation, on their withdrawal of troops. And while we believed that they are going to be stepping back, reports now tell us that that did not happen. In fact, they attempted to move further in. They attempted to further build structures on our territory. So amongst challenges, the top challenge will be, how do you trust the Chinese? They may tell you they will disengage, but the trust deficit will remain after the Galwan clash. Then, of course, the fact that there is already such high amount of tension at that location between the two sides, between the soldiers who are present there, because a heavy deployment and mobilization of forces has happened from both ends. Then there are disagreements over the line of actual control and what China, how China perceives it and how India perceives it. The entire process itself will take a really long time, and the minute you talk about a elongated process, there are more dangers of it getting derailed. And let's not forget that if you look at the Chinese situation itself, internally it's going through a massive economic crisis. Internally the government is staring at a huge amount of political problems. And of course at a global level they are being isolated for COVID. So perhaps for some leaders, including the president, it works to keep the pot boiling and to keep the nationalistic sentiment going by really challenging India or Taiwan or many of its other neighbors in various parts. That will continue to be a challenge for us as well. Tonight, I want to talk about how do we proceed from here. What will be the big challenges in our talks ahead? What do we need to watch out for? So we have senior journalists to give us inside track into what's been happening so far and the expectation. We have senior army generals, retired army generals, former army chief with us tonight to help us understand the pitfalls that will be there on ground for the way forward, and a senior former diplomat to really shed light on that aspect. First up, let's say good evening to all of our panelists here. General VP Malik, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Also great to have General Satish Dua. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Pinakranjan Chakravarti, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Former Secretary for Ministry of External Affairs. And we've got two senior journalists who've done exhaustive writing on this entire issue. Snehesh Philip, Senior Associate Editor with The Print, and Manu Pubby, Senior Editor with The Economic Times. So Manu, let's begin with you. Let's first help our viewers understand the kind of conversations that have actually happened and what possibly is the kind of agreement we are looking at for disengagement.
See, yesterday there was a very long marathon meeting, over 11 hours that lasted between the lieutenant generals of the two sides. And remember, we have had this conversation before. This is the second time this meeting has taken place. And after Galwan and what happened last Monday night, this was a very important meeting. The original plan was to have this meeting on the 16th of this month, after verifying that the Chinese have vacated Galwan. As we know, on the 15th night, when the clash happened, it was very clear the Chinese had not vacated their land. Now they have done so in Galwan at PP14. So yesterday's talks, the whole day was to figure out a roadmap for in the coming days. And I think both sides have decided to disengage at all points where there has been a buildup of troops. Remember, there are thousands of troops of both the PLA and the Indian Army on the border, and any clash like Galwan can lead to a major fight at a moment's notice. And I think the idea was to find a way to disengage slowly, withdrawing troops. And I think the Indian condition here is that China has been the aggressor. They have brought in the troops. They will first withdraw. We will follow them suit. But after what happened at Galwan, I think every step will be taken very carefully by India. We will not be able to trust Chinese on their word. We'll have to verify at every point. And I'm afraid it's a very long drawn process and a bumpy road ahead as far as this engagement continues. And we should not preclude the possibility of more violent engagements on the way as we go ahead to disengage.
Snehesh, would you like to also, add to that from what you've also learned, and the fact that, like Manu Pubby was pointing out, trust is going to be a big one. For most of what we've seen, the reports that have emerged, it's the Chinese who've, entered into our territory in many parts and deep into the territory, and it is the Chinese who will have to take the first step back and withdraw soldiers.
Yes, as Manu Pubby rightly mentioned, that this is going to be a phased withdrawal that will take place. It's not going to be a sudden disengagement that will happen. So you cannot expect that everything will be hunky and dory by tomorrow evening. So the phased withdrawal will, it will vary from places to places. For example, in Galwan, the Chinese have already withdrawn back into the territory. There's a phased manner in which they're supposed to go back further into their territory, and the Indians will also follow suit. Also in the hot spring area, a similar arrangement has been made. But one of the main concerning factor, or one of the main problematic area, is the finger area of Pangong, and it is here where it would be a long drawn process and would be much more, I would say, challenging than in other areas. So it is hoped by both sides that the disengagement will take place. There would be more meetings that would be held, not at the Corps Commander level, but at the GOC 3 Infantry Div level, which is the Major General level, as well as at the Brigadier and Colonel levels in the coming days, to ensure that the disengagement takes place smoothly. Remember that it was on the 6th of June when they had decided on a course of disengagement. However, the Chinese went back on their words in Galwan, which led to a clash on the 15th of June, in which 20 of our soldiers were killed in action. There were several those who have been killed, those who have been fatally injured on the Chinese side too. Besides injuries, the Chinese have not given exact statistics or the numbers as far as the fatal injuries on their side is concerned. But remember that this phase down that will happen, in which there will be a disengagement, will take time. It will happen in smaller batches. The speed would be different in different areas. So one will have to keep in mind that this disengagement will take over a period of time and not suddenly. That is very important.
Yes, several months. Let's see how it goes from here. The build-up itself and the incursions and transgressions themselves took several weeks, slowly by slowly, before we started reacting, at least at the government level. General VP Malik, the first big question that anybody is going to ask is, how do you trust the Chinese? They agreed to disengagement on 6th of June. We worked on the details, and then they turned around and started building more structures and attacked our men.
Firstly, I must re-emphasize what you said in your introduction, that all this is taking place in that shadow of the political level, at the economic level, as well as at the diplomatic level, interaction or whatever action that we are taking. Obviously, one can see that there is a major change taking place in China policy within India. So all this that at the military level, at the front line that is taking place is under that shadow. So that must be kept in mind. Now, as far as this disengagement is concerned, I have always believed that, while we keep talking to Chinese, and we should talk, there is no problem, but we have to see how they act or react on the ground. And that is more important. So when we take the next step after our talking, we must first make sure that whatever has been spoken to each other, it has been implemented on the ground. So monitoring of whatever they are doing now becomes necessary. And therefore, while all this disengagement is going to take time, there is another major factor that is going to come in now. We have given orders, quite rightly, I believe, that hereafter our troops will not fight with stones or go unarmed the way they were or not fire as they were doing earlier till 15th of this month. Now we have permitted them to open weapons if they require in self-defense, or if there is another mishap takes place while they are withdrawing or they are not withdrawing. So we'll have to work out on new SOPs, standard operating procedure, or call them rules of engagement, because we will not permit our troops to go without arms now, or with not giving them permission to fire as we were doing it earlier. So whatever is going on, the monitoring will have to be done very, very carefully. The surveillance devices will be up to tell us whether the people from the other side have they withdrawn or not, and only then we will take the next step. Until that time, I presume, and I'm sure it will happen, that our troops on the ground will remain deployed in an alert position all along.
All right, General Dua, would you like to also shed some more light on this? How do we proceed from here on? In many parts where they seem to have come, settled down, are at a point of advantage, but are in simplest words, sitting on our territory.
I think General Malik has covered all the angles very well. Allow me to just make a small comment to say that as I see it, I think it's after 1979, for the first time, that the Chinese army have got a little bloody nose at a very small point, but then whether they admit to the numbers more or less, but the fact is that they've suffered casualties. Now, another point is that tomorrow, when this meeting takes place, which decides the engagement protocols, that's the time to remember that this is a very delicate and a sensitive situation. Like General Malik said, we need to watch everything carefully. We need to monitor everything carefully and not just go by the words. So delicate as it is, it may be, but our troops are capable of handling things with restraint, while as the orders have been sort of renewed for them, that in case a situation develops, they are fully free to use their weapons if required. So the fact of the matter is, while we stand firm, I'm sure we will also handle the entire thing a little more sensibly and in a matured manner. Let's hope some good comes out of it soon.
Okay, let me also go across to Mr. Chakravarti. Mr. Chakravarti, good evening to you. There are many parts to this. There is obviously an economic side which the government has already begun to act on to see, the kind of pressure and signaling that can go on that front. There is the military level conversations which are currently going on. The extent of freedom that has now been given, the change in protocol that has happened for our Indian soldiers so they can carry these arms and use these arms if they deem necessary. But at a diplomatic level, what's the way forward? Even as we speak, there are important conversations where both the External Affairs Minister and the Defense Minister are involved.
Well, let me first begin by saying that when the INF treaty was signed, Ronald Reagan said used a very pithy phrase that is still popular today. He said, trust but verify. I think as far as the border disengagement is concerned, the verification is very, very important. Today we have national technical means, drones and all kinds of things to verify it. And obviously it has to be in a state kind of a thing. But let us not forget that this incident is not a localized incident for the heck of it. It is part of a larger geostrategic game that China has decided to play. At a time when the pandemic has created an atmosphere across the world where we are all very, very sort of engaged in domestic issues, healthcare, managing the pandemic, and things like that. So China has opened fronts everywhere. I mean, not just with India, but over Taiwan. Even today, their flights apparently sort of violated Taiwan's airspace. And then Japan, I think they have sent ships to the disputed Senkaku Islands in Japan, making Japan also concerned about and deploying and making them deploy certain sort of weaponry and troops, etc. And of course, the South China Sea story is very well known, how China is sort of behaving there. So China has decided that its time has come to throw its weight around and ensure that everybody accepts it as the dominant sort of hegemon, at least in Asia, till they can take on the USA and displace it as the global hegemon. This is how I see it in terms of its strategy. And this is a part, what they are doing on the border is part of that strategy. There are other, of course, collateral reasons why they are doing it. There's infrastructure, there's the change of the status of J&K 370, then certain statements that has been made about Aksai Chin and POK. Don't forget that China is heavily invested in the CPEC, which goes across the POK, and they plan to invest $60 billion there. So they are also trying to protect their investments in some way. And one of the reasons, of course, is that they do feel a little sort of nervous about Aksai Chin, because that has, the famous road to Xinjiang, etc. And in Xinjiang, what is happening to the Uyghur Muslims, that is a factor that's catching up. Many of the Muslim countries are protesting, etc. So I think a large kind of the larger canvas in which China is taking this action. So I will rest my case there, and you can carry forward the discussion.
Yes, actually that's an important point, and I will come back to you on that, because while China may, say that they want to disengage, there are many motives that they have to continue, to keep the pot boiling. And it's not just with India that we're seeing them do that. Across many of its other territories and borders and neighbors, there is similar kind of movement that's happening, perhaps to keep people and their own constituency back home at least distracted and a little happy about something. We've seen that happen across the world in many parts. When things get tough, this is what leaders like President Xi would react to and resort to. But I have one other important question in my mind, and maybe General Malik, we can begin with you on that. The fact of the matter also is that this conversation went on. The talks that held yesterday, and both of our senior journalists here said, went on for over 10 hours, almost 11 hours. Is that normal to have such extensive, in-depth talks in one single day? And if that's really the case, what do we take away from that? What's the indication about the level of agreement or cooperation that may be happening?
Well, that's not quite usual. You're right there. And the fact that they sat together for 11 hours, obviously they were having to discuss a lot of details. So it's not just some activity, but the details of that activity. If they have to disengage, I'm sure they would have worked out various steps that they would take at each location from where they are expected to withdraw. And it's not just the withdrawal from the disputed areas, like we were talking about north of Pangangso between Finger 4 and Finger 8, but also from other locations in Ladakh. And, the earlier agreements that we have signed with each other, they expect that we should not carry out large-scale exercises, we should not be having large-scale troops in those areas. So all those also, I'm sure, will come up. And all these aspects of their disengagement or withdrawal of troops from the location where they should not be, they will have to go in much greater detail than earlier because of the incident that have taken place in the recent past.
General Dua, while I think all of us agree that it's going to be a long-drawn process, and it's not as if the disengagement or the withdrawal of troops will happen just tomorrow, but for our viewers to also understand that, why is it so? I mean, if there is an agreement that you have come into our territory or come too close to the line of actual control, crossed your own boundary and you need to go back, then why should it take so long?
When we work out the disengagement protocols tomorrow, and that has already been decided, in that disengagement protocol, timelines will be laid for each level of disengagement. So to simplify it, let us say there is a tent at a place and there are a couple of other tents slightly behind. So perhaps one side will pull out a tent from one place and go back, and the other side will then follow suit and do something else that would be agreed to. Then both sides would monitor that, and then the next step would be taken. Simultaneously, it's not only about, like General Malik brought out, it is not only about troops in contact. There is also some other issues which may be in depth. All the forces that have moved in for an exercise or mobilization, for instance, may have moved to a certain point, which is not the usual thing. So to put it very simply, to appear less menacing to each other, then we decide on some protocols as to how we will cool the passions by doing this, rather than, you just can't disengage, say, 200 meters or 1 kilometer behind, and then rest everyone is still poised to be able to take action. So what I was trying to get at, that it's a step-by-step process. Each step would be in detail. Then after each step, it will be monitored. When I say monitored, then patrols from both sides will go verify it. And when they verify, there would be some differences. Look, this was not supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be further, or this was supposed to be like that. So all those things, and remember, all this talking is taking place through, via interpreters. So it takes a lot of time to verify things and to make sure that things are going as per a decided schedule. And last sentence, if things don't go as per a decided schedule, then it calls for more meetings. And there are also meetings going on at different levels. So all that does take time.
Okay, thank you for the detailed explanation, because it's also important for everybody to understand why it should be like this. And of course, in the light of the fact that there is some amount of trust deficit, it has to be done little by little, where you see the other side take a step and then you do the same. Manu, I think reports are also just coming in, and it's been now confirmed that the defense minister at that trilateral will not be having a separate conversation with his Chinese counterpart. Was that on the agenda earlier, something that has now been changed?
No, it was never on the agenda. I think the Indian side was very clear the engagement has to happen at the military level, and the defense minister don't need to talk as of now, because it is being handled at the lieutenant general level. Remember, the external affairs minister spoke to his counterpart last week. So this is again, again a sign of Chinese propaganda. What we have seen is not just a border build-up. We have seen a very coordinated, a very well-planned, and a well-executed psyops being held by the Chinese side. It is not just that they have moved troops to the border. They've been releasing videos. They've been putting out false information. They've been trying to psych us out by putting up photographs. And this, all of this points out to me, this is not a simple border clash. It is something more. And remember, you're dealing with a very, very deceptive adversary. And this is an adversary which does not follow the rules of the game. So while we disengage in the coming days, we have to be very careful of the fact that whenever China feels that the international law and the international order is in its favor, they will cite international laws to you. But whenever it is not, it will use force. So we have to be clear about the kind of person or the adversary we're dealing with. He does not believe in rules. He does not believe in fair play. So every step that we are taking now and in the coming weeks and days has to be verified, has to be carefully evaluated, because you never know when it turns. And that's why I think our guys are prepared. We have had really massive deployments on the border. We've seen videos of aircraft, of troops moving in. So I don't think that the Indian side is taking any chances at all. While the talks are on, I think the posture is very, very certain that it is a stern posture. We are ready for anything. And while we want them to disengage, we are not trusting them on their word anymore.
Yes, well, you're right there. General Malik, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience of withdrawal of troops during Kargil war. If you recall, it took us almost 6 days for us after agreeing with each other that they will withdraw from certain positions. And during the withdrawal, they did create problems, and we had to sort that out. And even at the end of it, when the dates were over, after 6 days, they had not withdrawn from two locations, and we had to hit them at those positions. So all I'm trying to say is that the disengagement process is not always peaceful. One has to be prepared for any mishap or any intentional, deliberate action being taken by an adversary whom you cannot trust. And I'm sure the troops on the ground, the forces on the ground will take that into account.
Well, thank you for sharing that experience and that insight, into understanding how it really pans out and how it really works out on the ground. Snehesh, if I can just come to you on, the point that Manu was also making about the kind of tactics that China has resorted to, and it's not just on the ground at the military level, but otherwise also the kind of propaganda that they have resorted to. Now, how is it that we are seeing a situation that they have suddenly agreed for this disengagement? Has it been a result of the diplomatic conversations, the economic moves that we've made? What are you picking up from your own sources as to how this turnabout has happened from June 6th to June 9th to what happened on June 15th to now?
Well, that's a good question that you've raised. As far as the disengagement is concerned, remember that it's not that the military talks that are happening. There are multiple talks at various levels. Now, for example, there are the backroom talks that have taken place, back channel talks that have taken place. At the same time, for example, tomorrow, the joint secretary from handling the China desk, as well as the joint secretary in China handling the India desk, would be talking to each other on boundary issues. Now, so these are all part of the larger talks that are going on. Some out in the open, some not in the open. However, remember that it is not the first time that China have agreed to disengage. It had agreed on the 6th also. However, they went back on the disengagement side. They set up two particular tent-like structures which were objected to by the Indians. Again, so as I said, it was always felt that the China has moved in the large numbers. They've moved inside the LC at particular inside the LAC at the particular points. At the same time, they've also built up along the LAC. But one of the main problem lies is with the Pangong, the northern banks of the Pangong Lake, and that is where the issue lies. While India is talking to China, while both sides have agreed to it, we should not be under any impression that India is blindly following what China is agreeing. There are steps that have been put in place. India is aware of the fact that China, as Manu rightly mentioned, that China is a country which does not believe in rule-based orders. It does not believe in any kind of thing. It falls back. It's very quick to fall back on the words, on the promises that China has made. So India will be taking its time, will be monitoring every single de-escalation steps that have been agreed upon.
Oh yes, absolutely. In fact, let me bring in Mr. Chakravarti on that as well, on the deceptive neighbor that we have, the unpredictability of of Chinese, and the fact that right now they have many challenges. One of them being COVID and the global isolation that they face. The other being the trade war that they're already involved in. So there are many layers to this. Not just what India is doing and the kind of infrastructure that we are building on our side of the border, in Ladakh or in Sikkim or elsewhere. So, Mr. Chakravarti, for your final comments on the way forward, what is it that we should watch out for when it comes to China?
Well, let me begin by saying that deception is the core, is at the heart of any strategy, any military and geostrategic sort of games that nations play. And if you are a student of international relations, you will read a chapter called The Ruses of War. Ruse basically means deception, and that is embedded in Chinese sort of very long philosophy of the art of war that Shunzi wrote, 2,500 years ago. So I think we must remember that a culture and a civilization absorbs and then it goes into a DNA. That during a war, that you have to use all the methods. Today we have many more methods because we have digital, we have social media, we have all kinds of other methods, electronic methods that we didn't have in earlier years. So today nations tend to use all these methods, narratives, false narratives or anything to unsettle the enemy or unsettle the adversary. When you are really having, when you have defined your adversary and you know what kind of adversary you have. So I think that is part of the game and it's par for the course. I think militaries understand it, strategists understand it. But your question as to where we go from here, as I said, we must trust and verify as the two militaries engage and decide to turn. And I think our bottom line should be status quo ante, because that is what we feel would give the confidence or at least raise a certain level of confidence between the two sides. The other thing, of course, is a major change in the standard operating procedure. I don't know whether we will agree to revert to the earlier, or we will keep, or we might insist on saying, since you violated it, we will keep our weapons and reserve the right to use it if it again reaches that kind of a flashpoint. So I think these are some of the issues that had to be taken. And I think today the RIC dialogue took place. I'm not sure what exactly happened there, but I think there may have been some effort at sort of, putting a little bit of, pouring a little water, over the troubled, putting some oil, as we say, over the troubled waters. So I don't know what happened. And our defense minister will be also in Moscow, where there will be probably talks, but may not be on these issues. But obviously, there will be talks, and I think there will be some developments there also. So in a sense, my overall view is that things are on track at the moment for disengagement, for going back to the status quo, but it will take some time, and it's not going to happen very easily, because the Chinese have this thing about not losing face. So I think they will take their time so that they can say that, okay, we have not lost face, we have agreed to go back, etc. And I think that is what we have to wait for. I don't think this is going to happen in a few months. It might even go on till the whole of summer, because the summer is the only time they can all be entrenched there. When the snow comes, etc., I think it becomes more difficult to stay on there. And one more thing I must say, that the terrain being what it is, obviously you cannot have a full-fledged war, with tanks, etc. It has to be, smaller engagements and, creeping kind of engagements. So I think it's not possible to have a war in those kind of heights in that terrain. So I think we must be careful, we must trust, and we must verify, and we must keep our eyes open on other sectors where things could happen, where China might again provoke. And I think we basically have to be far more alert now on the border, and because China has shown. And then, of course, let us see how China's other fronts pan out. Then I think we might see how China finally decides that the kind of road it wants to take.
Well, I had so many other questions because I have such a great panel tonight with so many insights, but I'm sure, like all of you also have said, that this is going to go on for a while. It's not something that gets resolved immediately, and we will have a lot more conversations to help our viewers understand what exactly is going on. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us here on this conversation about India and China. Viewers, this is just step one, maybe half a step in the direction of a possible disengagement where the two sides have largely agreed upon it. Tomorrow it will be another crucial day. Tomorrow will be the meeting when we decide on how we have to go about it. That's when you actually get down to the basics on who starts first, to what extent, and then the other side, and what the other side has to do. And there will be agreements and disagreements, and that kind of will take time, and that will dictate how the disengagement process continues from here on over the next several weeks. Meanwhile, it is not an issue that can be resolved just at the military level. The army does what it has to do, and they're the best judge for that. The government has to do what it has to do in terms of policy, in terms of diplomatic aggression, in terms of diplomatic response, economic response, political response. And all of that will have to happen because it is China that we are talking about, a country that cannot be trusted, a country that is highly unpredictable, and a country that we do have the might to take on and give a response to. So let's keep a close eye on how it goes on from tonight in the coming few weeks. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. Welcome back, viewers. After a tug of war in the top court, finally approval was given and permission was given by the Supreme Court for the Jagannath Puri Rath Yatra to take place. It was due to begin today, and it did begin today. And today was day one of the processions that went through the city of Puri. The visuals on your screens are actually of the annual chariot festival that is normally attended by lakhs of devotees. But obviously in times of a pandemic, that wasn't allowed, and that's been highly restricted. Now, the number of attendees and everything else about how it must be conducted was defined by the Supreme Court yesterday. The top court said that all the entry points into Puri via air, rail and road must be closed. State government should impose a complete restriction in movement. Apart from this yatra, of course, the chariot shall be pulled by no more than 500 people, and these 500 people will also include the policemen and the officials on duty. So that was the cap that was put out and the rule that had to be followed. Of course, social distancing had to be followed. People had to wear masks, and the government and the administration was to ensure that minimum number of people participate while the rituals are actually carried on and rituals are actually held. Now, on day one, and you can see it from the visuals, yes, in comparison to any other year, it's radically different and lakhs of those devotees are missing. But it has to be, viewers, in comparison to any other year, because these are unprecedented times. These are times of a pandemic. Now, after day one, what I want to understand is, can we improve it from here on? Can we ensure that even the kind of crowding that we saw, even the kind of people with no mask that we saw, the social distancing in parts being forgotten that we saw, which is visible in the visuals, that doesn't happen? What are the lessons learned from day one that can be used for the next few days? This yatra goes on for 9 days, I believe. Also keep in mind, viewers, that this is just the beginning. India is entering what is considered as a festival period, where you have the Ganpati Puja, which sees large processions on streets, especially in states like Maharashtra, all across the state. Then you have the Durga Puja that happens in many parts of the country. Again, similar large crowds, and processions that take place. Can the way that we handle this specific ritual really set a template for the festivals that are coming up after this? And let's be honest, the pandemic isn't going away. This entire year, if not all of next year, we will have to follow a significant set of these rules of social distancing and minimum exposure. So let's say good evening to those who are joining us to help us understand how do we really go about it. And I've got Mr. A.L. Banerjee, former DGP of Uttar Pradesh, as well as Advocate Sai Deepak, who actually represented the chief priest of the Jagannath temple in the case that was heard in Supreme Court. And of course, there they were given the permission to hold this entire yatra. But first, Mr. Banerjee, I wanted to come to you because largely this will be a challenge for the authorities. And obviously it becomes tricky when it's in matters of religion and faith. But when it comes to the health and safety and people's lives, perhaps that should take precedence. So how do we ensure that even in times of pandemic, people can hold basic rituals but don't resort to the usual kind of festivals that we see?
Tanvi, for that kind of a thing to happen, that people do not get into a frenzy or do not act irresponsibly, this is something which education can fulfill and example can buttress. This is a great thing that is happening right now. The Rath Yatra, it was scheduled to take place and it is being held as per schedule, and with most of the restrictions, in fact, which the Supreme Court, in fact, all of the restrictions which the Supreme Court has imposed, very correctly so, as far as I am, as a law and order person is concerned, if I look at it from that angle. And the only way is to be able to educate people as to these are the things that you should do and should not do. You cannot really force anybody, because there are occasions when people would come out, they will be careless, and there is definitely a possibility of contamination or infection. As you rightly said, this is a state of war. And in this state of war, which is not going to go away too soon, until and unless it is sorted out right and proper, we have to take all kinds of precaution possible to ensure that the lives are safe.
Yes, no, absolutely. But when it comes to matters of faith, Mr. Banerjee, sometimes we see even the authorities hesitate, not wanting to come in the way. I mean, at the end of the day, if I see some of the visuals that we saw today, it is concerning for me that even this much is being, done right now. That people shoulder to shoulder, standing right next to each other during that yatra, a big crowd that has gathered to pull the chariot itself is not okay, and one person there can actually lead to hundreds and thousands of other cases then taking place, which is a problem. Now, as per the rules and regulations, of course, everybody had to be tested, but I doubt there was any time for that, because the orders only came in yesterday, and this morning everything had to begin. Let me see if I can go across to Sai Deepak, who's also joining us, and he represented, of course, the chief priest in this entire case. Sai Deepak, what's your own sense? To what extent were we able to really follow the norms while holding this yatra today? Do you think there is scope for improvement? Because some of the visuals are concerning in terms of crowd.
So, thank you for inviting me. I have 3 factual clarifications and corrections to make. The court did not impose these directions or these restrictions. These directions, or rather these restrictions, were self-imposed, and they were volunteered to by the temple committee, including the chief priest, as part of their application for modification of the order, which was passed on 18th of June 2020. And this is in accordance with the minutes of the meeting decided by the temple committee as well as the administrators on 4th of May, not even June, 4th of May, well before the construction of the rathas or the chariots was actually green signaled by the MHA to the state government through a letter on 7th of May. Therefore, firstly, the attempt yesterday before the Supreme Court was not to seek dilution of the restrictions, but in fact to say that we ourselves have imposed all these restrictions. And it was pointed out to the court that close to 1,174 people, including servitors, temple personnel, carpenters, artisans, and everybody involved in the Rath Yatra, had imposed upon themselves a quarantine for over 1.5 months. And then everyone was subjected to COVID testing. All of them turned out to be COVID negative. This was long before. And only after that, we had actually requested them to allow us to proceed with the Rath Yatra. Therefore, it's not a situation where people blindly rush to the court asking for protection of their religious rights, irrespective of any concerns of public health. In fact, the administrators, the servitors, the police personnel, and everybody involved in the temple administration are extremely conscious of it. Now, coming to the second question of can more be done? Of course, more can always be done in any kind of a situation. I don't think any system is perfect, and I think this is work in progress. But most importantly, we have to ask ourselves the simple question. Now, why is it that no questions are being raised with respect to consumption of alcohol and opening of liquor vents, so to speak, when 76,000 stores are only available for a 5 crore population across the country? And I don't think social distancing norms are being followed in any place where alcohol is being sold. But no questions are being raised in that particular regard, and this is a year-round phenomenon. Whereas the Jagannath Rath Yatra is barely for 9 days, and these were restrictions
imposed by whom?
Who has asked these questions? I don't think the Supreme Court has actually banned.
No questions are being raised by whom?
The Supreme Court has not questioned the decision of the
Union Ministry. Well, the states themselves have gone ahead and shut down stores. The court itself has heard cases about opening and reopening liquor stores in specific states. Many of the states and local administrations have shut down the stores.
No, you're wrong, because I am the one who appeared in the
yes,
particular petition.
Yes, but the case was taken up. The state, 1 minute now, let me reply, Sai Deepak. Okay, let me reply. I don't want to get into a confrontation with you. You've asked a question, let me answer and finish.
I'm not asking the question.
And I think it's highly,
I am pointing out
and I think it's highly wrong for you to even compare the two things, to compare a ritual and a religious practice to a commercial activity. One doesn't justify the other, does it?
So sorry, this is not a simple commercial activity. It's not an essential commercial activity as far as sale of alcohol is concerned. And therefore, if your question is fundamentally with respect to public health,
it's a commercial activity.
It is not just a commercial activity. It's a non-essential commercial activity.
So for that reason, should we forget the public health concerns?
Not at all.
As the leaders of a religious practice or religion?
Questions that people should have raised even with respect to alcohol sale, and most importantly, the question that you have not answered so far is, are there any restrictions the alcohol industry has imposed upon itself when they decided to open these stores? They did not. Whereas this particular entity, this particular temple has imposed all these restrictions upon itself proactively, at least for 45 days before they decided to proceed with the Rath Yatra. That's the point. From temple personnel to police personnel to carpenters to artisans, everyone at every level of the hierarchy has undertaken this. And just to give you a sense of proportion, the population usually for Rath Yatra in Puri alone is close to 10 to 12 lakhs. Compare that to the numbers that you're seeing today, and compare that to the fact that devotees approach the court to basically say, we are happy to not turn up on the streets. We are happy to see this live on television. That is the extent to which people associated with this particular festival.
I think you missed. I'm not too sure, Sai. Okay. I'm not too sure, but I think you missed my initial introduction, my introduction to this story and to this conversation. Sai Deepak, I started off by saying that what we saw today was radically different from what we see every year. The lakhs of devotees who are usually out there on streets participating were not there. And that's good.
I respect you for that.
And we've managed to do that. But I'm only asking you.
Yes.
Yes, but my conversation, so I know you're coming here with the thought to defend this, but I have a feeling you're misunderstanding what I'm asking you. My question to you is, how else can this be improved? And I ask you this question, Sai Deepak, because I believe this could become a template for the series of festivals that India will see later this year, from Ganpati Puja, where authorities will have to look at how to allow that, to Durga Puja and other parts of this country.
I get your question.
Where all of that begins, what is the lesson that can be learned from here? Yes.
I don't think a public health concern must be rendered secondary under any circumstances, regardless of whichever activity is in question. So I understand the question. I completely appreciate that sentiment, because at the end of the day, people must survive and people must live, and there is no activity which can take precedence over that. Okay, so there is no two ways about that. Point number one. Point number two, I would be the last person to see a religious festival or a religious activity being held responsible for spread of, let's say, the pandemic, because then it tarnishes that festival and that community and that institution for eternity. Therefore, that's not in my interest either. Three, what is it that they can do? Frankly speaking, I think they had very little time to prepare between the passing of the order, and the order was made available late in the evening on the 22nd, with the Rath Yatra starting at 8:30, 9 o'clock on the 23rd.
Correct.
Okay. Therefore, they had very little time to prepare. And whatever they had done, they had already done bearing in mind the requirements that they had imposed upon themselves and the restrictions they had imposed upon themselves. And the state government has also taken the responsibility along with the union ministry to ensure that the rules are followed. And therefore, I think the state administration, along with the temple administration committee and the stakeholders, the devotees, so to speak, or the sevayats and the servitors, will take stock of the situation. And I'm sure they must be taking stock of the situation based on the turnout today and the kind of management that they had to undertake today. So I'm just saying that please let's be respectful of the fact that this is a very sensitive community which has been proactive about this. So I respect your position on that particular issue. Perhaps, and not perhaps, I'm sure that for the next 8 days, they will draw lessons from what has happened today. And today, I think, was a Herculean task for them to pull off, considering the time they had between last evening and today in the morning. Therefore, I'm sure they will draw lessons, incorporate this feedback that is coming from certain quarters, and they'll work on it. Just take a look at the videos that you yourself are presenting. Look at the thinning crowds. That's barely, and if anybody's been to Puri, even on a normal day without the Rath Yatra, that's not the crowd that we should be looking at. This is barely 500 to 600 people behind each Ratha. That's not even the case. Right? Yeah, please.
Okay, fair enough. I take your point. And in the coming days, let's see what lessons are learned and how it's improved. I agree with you. The order came late last night. A lot of what is had to be done will probably take time. For example, Mr. Banerjee, for such kind of events to be held, even if they are at a smaller scale and not as big as the Yatra that usually happens for Ganpati or Durga Puja or any of the other festivals that will come up starting few weeks later. Is it really possible for authorities to ensure that social distancing is followed, or that everybody who appears out on the street as part of this crowd can be screened? Just how practical is it?
You see, screening everybody is not a solution, but here the Supreme Court, or rather, as the advocate of the Mandir has just said, that they had imposed conditions on themselves and they had told the Supreme Court about the conditions which they had imposed, and they would go by that. So they had done previous thinking. But for any administration to be able to enforce 100% checking of this kind does not seem possible. Again, we come back to the same thing. Until and unless you educate the people, you make them aware of what is possible. But this puja, this Jagannath Yatra, definitely is a template, definitely tells us what can be done by those who are devotees, those who want to celebrate something. Say, for example, Ganapati Puja is going to come up very soon. Then there will be Vishwakarma Puja. After that, there will be Durga Puja, and you have a whole list of other things that are going. The local organizers, with the help of the authorities, should be able to do as good as is possible, the best that they can.
Yes. Yes, and let's not forget that all of this will then build up to a Mahakumbh also that's planned next year. And I'm very skeptical that by that time also we'll have a vaccine. Hopefully, maybe, yes, a drug somewhere available. But if not, then authorities will have to look at how to plan it. And maybe rather than leaving it till last minute and for this, all of these conversations to happen last minute, that doesn't give much time to the authorities to plan and implement it on ground. Next time, everybody agrees on and plans it better beforehand, and the situation is made clearer much beforehand, so that we can ensure that there is better planning. Of course, we will wait and watch how it pans out for the rest of the days for the Jagannath Puri Yatra. Mr. Banerjee and Sai Deepak, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and having this conversation. Viewers, completely out of time on this edition of the Urban Debate. Thank you so much for joining us.